December 1991. A hunter walking a logging trail near Forest Hill, California, finds the body of a woman who's been missing for 19 days. Her condition doesn't match the timeline. Investigators are looking at something that doesn't add up. Pathologists later conclude she was likely kept somewhere else first, before she ended up on that road. That's the first question this case never fully answers. Where was she during those 19 days? Here's the second. The house she vanished from gave investigators almost nothing to work with. No forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Just one cigarette butt on the walkway outside, dusted for a print that leads nowhere. 2 more fingerprints turn up weeks later, on evidence found near her body, run through the national database. No match. For the next 34 years, that's where this case sits. Not forgotten, not abandoned, unsolved, because none of the physical evidence can be tied to a name. There's a third question, and it doesn't surface until decades later, when detectives go back through old state records and find something that had been sitting in a file since 1980. A written warning from psychiatrists working for the state of California, describing exactly the kind of danger this case would turn out to involve. This is the investigation into the disappearance and murder of Cindy Wanner. Closing it takes 3 generations of forensic technology, 1 overlooked detail about geography, and a facial recognition system built for a completely different purpose. Cynthia K. Wanner went by Cindy to the people who knew her. 35 years old, a wife, a mother of 2. She and her husband Robert had left Thornton, Colorado, a few years earlier to start over in Rancho Cordova, California. Cindy worked as a house cleaner, steady work, not a favor or a side job, and she often brought her children along, the way many working mothers without regular childcare did in 1991. That's why she was where she was on November 25th of that year. It was a Monday, the week of Thanksgiving. Her sister, Susan Rye, lived in Granite Bay, an upscale suburb east of Sacramento in Placer County. Susan and her husband, Phil, had a family trust matter to settle that morning and needed the house cleaned before meeting their attorney. Cindy arrived that morning, bringing her 11-month-old, Ashley, who was set up in a high chair while Cindy worked through the house. Susan and Phil left for their appointment, returned briefly around midday, then left again. Cindy stayed behind, still working. Ashley stayed in the high chair. What happened between that midday return and the early afternoon has never been fully reconstructed. What's documented is what came after. Later that day, Robert pulled into the driveway with the couple's older daughter, 4-year-old Carly. He expected to find his wife finishing up. The front door was unlocked. Inside, Ashley was still in the high chair, crying, a handful of Cheerios left unfinished in front of her. Cindy's cleaning supplies were still out. Her coat hung by the door. Her shoes sat where she'd left them. Her car was still in the driveway. His wife was gone. Robert called the Placer County Sheriff's Department within minutes, reporting his wife missing from a house that, by every visible sign, looked completely undisturbed. Placer County investigators arrived that same afternoon. Forensic technician Faye Springer processed the scene, and what she found, or didn't find, became the defining problem of this case for the next 3 decades. The house was intact. No blood, no damage, no sign that anyone had resisted whoever came through that door. For a case that would ultimately depend entirely on physical evidence, that absence was itself a problem. The one anomaly was outside, a single cigarette butt on the walkway. Neither Cindy nor Robert smoked, and neither did Susan or Phil. Springer flagged it immediately. If it belonged to whoever was responsible, it was the only physical trace they'd left. It was tested. The print came back clear enough to compare, but in 1991, a fingerprint only meant something if the person who left it already had prints on file somewhere in the system. This one didn't match anyone at all. A second lead developed separately, through Cindy's bank. Roughly 3 hours after she vanished, her card was used once, at a mini-mart near Granite Bay, placing a specific person at a specific machine at a specific time. Detectives requested the surveillance footage. It had already been recorded over. The bank hadn't flagged the activity to police quickly enough, and by the time the request reached the store, the tape that could have shown investigators exactly who used that card was gone. Only hours into the case, investigators had a fingerprint and a bank transaction, 2 real pieces of evidence, and no way to connect either one to an actual person. 19 days later, a hunter walking a remote road outside Forest Hill found her. It was December 14th, 1991, roughly 40 miles from the house she'd vanished from. a detail that told investigators something on its own. Whoever was responsible had transportation, time, and a reason to choose somewhere this isolated. That kind of planning pointed away from a spur-of-the-moment act, towards someone who had already thought through what came next. Faye Springer, the same technician who had processed the house back in November, worked this scene too. 2 locations, 40 miles apart, and the same pattern each time, evidence clearly present, with no way yet to say who it belonged to. The autopsy confirmed she'd been sexually assaulted and had died by strangulation, but her condition raised an immediate question. After 19 days outdoors, the level of decomposition should have been far more advanced than it was. That discrepancy pointed to a disturbing conclusion. She had likely been held somewhere, a controlled, possibly refrigerated environment, for some period before she was killed and left at that location. For investigators, this wasn't a detail to dwell on. It told them something concrete about who they were looking for. Someone with access to a private space, and enough control over it to keep her there without anyone noticing. Near her body, investigators recovered a discarded bag, beer cans, a videotape, and fibers matching trace evidence found directly on Cindy, physically tying the bag to her. 2 fingerprints came off the cans, 1 off the tape. These went through the same national database as the cigarette butt print. This time, the odds should have been better. 3 separate prints instead of 1. The result was the same. Nothing came back. DNA testing existed in 1991, but not at a level capable of reading partial or degraded samples the way it can now. The biological evidence recovered from the site went into storage, not because investigators gave up on it, but because the science to use it hadn't been built yet. The case went cold. It did not close. While Cindy's case sat unsolved, the answer to it had already been written down, in a record that had nothing to do with her. In 1980, a man still in his late teens broke into a home in Sacramento County. Inside were a 71-year-old woman and her 11-year-old granddaughter. He assaulted both of them. He was convicted and sentenced to 19 years. At sentencing, state-appointed psychiatrists evaluated him directly, and their findings went into his permanent record. He met the formal classification of a mentally disordered sex offender, not a candidate for treatment. In plain terms, the state's own experts had determined, in writing, that this was someone who posed an ongoing danger. That kind of classification isn't issued casually. It reflects a clinical judgment that standard rehabilitation wasn't expected to work, the sort of finding that should, in theory, weigh heavily against an early release. He served 11 of those 19 years. Early in 1991, at age 30, he was released. His name was James Lawhead Jr. 10 months later, Cindy Wanner disappeared from her sister's home. That reveal might feel like an answer. It isn't the whole one. Lawhead was already in state records in 1991. His conviction, his classification, his release date, all on file. The real question this case still had to answer wasn't who he was. It was how someone the system already knew about could go unconnected to this evidence for the next 34 years. A formal psychiatric classification isn't a casual note in a file. It's a professional judgment that someone is dangerous and unlikely to change. That judgment existed for Lawhead before he ever walked out of prison. What the system did with that information, and why release followed anyway, is a question the record doesn't answer. Something more specific to Cindy remains unanswered too. Investigators have never officially confirmed whether Lawhead knew her sister, or had any prior connection to that house at all. He may have targeted her specifically. He may have simply been in the area and seen an opportunity. Even after a full legal resolution, that detail was never settled. What is certain? A man the state had already flagged, in writing, as an unmanaged risk was released into the community. And within less than a year, a mother of 2 was gone. For more than a decade after the murder, Lawhead wasn't hiding. He lived openly in Northern California, appearing in official records the way any registered offender is required to. In 2002, that requirement caught up with him. Arrested in Placer County for failing to register, tied directly to his 1980 conviction. A paperwork violation, but it put him back on record in the same county Cindy had disappeared from 11 years earlier. In 2005, he was arrested again, this time on a weapons charge in Lincoln, California. He fled before it reached trial. Whether his prints from either arrest were ever cross-checked against the evidence still sitting in storage from 1991 has never been made clear. If they were, the comparison didn't turn up a match at the time. One more point where this case might have closed years before it did. That's the turning point. Up to 2005, Lawhead existed on paper: arrests, addresses, court dates. After he fled, that trail stopped entirely. When investigators eventually searched records across the US and Canada, they found nothing. No address, no employment, no further contact with law enforcement anywhere. Sheriff Wayne Wu would later describe it plainly: the man had simply vanished. Investigators said they'd worked through every possibility they could think of, that he was living under another false identity, that he'd left the country entirely, or that he was no longer alive. None of those questions had an answer yet. He was in police custody once before, in the same state, 14 years after Cindy's murder, and the search that followed his escape from that case wouldn't succeed for another 21 years. What replaced him was a new identity: Vincent Reynolds. Under that name, he settled in Bullhead City, Arizona, near the Nevada border, in a house that wasn't registered to him. The property belonged to his sister, Terry Lawhead Steele, 71, of San Clemente, California. Investigators asked her more than once over the years whether she'd had contact with her brother. Her answer never changed, including weeks before his arrest. She hadn't heard from him in over 20 years. That wasn't true. Investigators later found the two had stayed in regular contact the entire time. She was the one person outside law enforcement who could have ended this search years earlier. She chose not to. By the mid-2020s, this case had outlived most of the people who first worked it. It hadn't been abandoned. Placer County's cold case unit had a standing practice. Every time DNA testing technology advanced, they resubmitted what had been collected decades earlier. Each round came back the same way: inconclusive. That pattern explains almost everything about how this case eventually broke. The technology available in 1991 simply couldn't process degraded, trace-level samples with any reliability. Each new generation of sequencing could recover slightly more from the same evidence than the one before it, and investigators kept resubmitting, tracking the pace of the science rather than waiting on luck. The final submission went to the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office Forensic Lab, processed with next-generation DNA sequencing, the most advanced method available. This time, it worked. The profile matched James Lawhead Jr. After 34 years, evidence collected from two separate 1991 crime scenes finally had a name attached to it. A name wasn't the same as a location, though. Investigators knew who they were looking for. They still had no idea where he'd been for the past 2 decades, or whether he was even alive. By then, Carly and Ashley were grown women, still living without an answer to the question that had followed them since childhood: what happened to their mother that afternoon in Granite Bay? As Placer County prepared a public appeal, someone reviewing the file noticed a detail that had been sitting there the entire time. Lawhead's own registered address in 1991 sat roughly 1.5 miles from the mini-mart where Cindy's ATM card had been used, hours after she vanished. The proximity had always existed in the record. It simply hadn't meant anything until there was a name to attach to it. Before the appeal went out, a call came in from an unexpected direction. The Scottsdale Police Department in Arizona had run a photo of Lawhead through the state's Department of Transportation facial recognition system, built to catch driver's license fraud, not solve decades-old homicides. It worked anyway. The system returned a match, a license issued under the name Vincent Reynolds. On April 24, 2026, Placer County detectives, working with the Bullhead City Police Department, arrested Lawhead in his own driveway. Bullhead City Police spokeswoman Emily Frommelt confirmed he had no prior contact with local law enforcement under that identity and was taken into custody without incident. Inside the house, investigators found loaded firearms staged throughout the property, $15,000 in cash, and a burner phone, items suggesting he'd stayed prepared to disappear again at short notice, even after 20 years of quiet. He was booked into the Mojave County Jail in Kingman, Arizona, then extradited to Placer County on April 30th, held at the Auburn Jail to await trial. The extradition took less than a week, a sign of how quickly both states moved once his identity had been confirmed. Investigators also began retracing Lawhead's movements through Washington, Oregon, and Arizona over the 2 decades he'd spent as Vincent Reynolds, checking whether he had any connection to other unsolved cases in those states. The day after his arrest, his sister, Terry Lawhead Steele, was taken into custody in Lancaster County, South Carolina, and charged as an accessory. A search of her San Clemente home confirmed both her ownership of the Arizona property and her ongoing contact with her brother. With Lawhead in custody, the case moved from investigation to prosecution. Placer County District Attorney Morgan Geyer laid out the charges. 1 count of murder, with special circumstance allegations of rape and kidnapping, plus an independent kidnapping charge. In California, a special circumstance conviction is what makes a case eligible for the harshest available sentencing, the legal mechanism that ultimately determined how this case would end. At the announcement, Geyer addressed what the case represented after 35 years. Just because the passage of time doesn't mean justice diminishes in importance, she said, describing a family that had lived with unanswered questions for over 3 decades and had earned real accountability. Lawhead never went to trial. On July 14, 2026, he pleaded guilty to every charge and formally waived his right to appeal. Judge De Jesus sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. That same day, his sister's case concluded too. She had entered a no-contest plea to the accessory charge the previous month, in June. She was sentenced to time served, plus 2 years of probation. One question about this investigation remains genuinely open. Lawhead was in custody once before, in 2005, on an unrelated weapons charge. He fled before trial, and the search that eventually caught up to him didn't succeed for another 21 years. Using tools that, in 2005, didn't yet exist in any form capable of solving this. Would this case have ended years earlier if he'd simply been held through that 2005 arrest? Or was he determined enough, even then, to build a new identity regardless? There's no clean answer. It's one this case leaves behind. The 2 people who lived with this case longest weren't investigators. They were Cindy's daughters. Carly was 4 when her mother was murdered. Ashley, the baby left in the high chair that afternoon, wasn't yet 1. Neither grew up with an answer. By 2026, both were well into adulthood. Carly approaching 40, Ashley in her mid-30s. Each had lived more years without an answer than most people spend building an entire career. What eventually closed that gap wasn't a single dramatic discovery. It was technology finally catching up to evidence that had existed the entire time, paired with a department that never let the file close for good. Investigators submitted the same evidence for testing again and again, fully aware most attempts would fail. They did it anyway. Sheriff Wayne Wu called this one of the most notorious cold cases in the county's history, and said the department had never stopped working it. Looking back, several pieces made this case possible. The fingerprint, the ATM transaction, the psychiatric record, the facial recognition match. None of them solved anything alone. It took all of them connecting before the case reached its resolution. This investigation opened with 2 questions. Who was responsible for Cindy Wanner's death, and why the evidence built against him took 34 years to connect to a name? Both are now solved. DNA identified James Lawhead Jr., evidence the technology of 2026 could finally read, decades after it was first collected. Not everything was resolved. Investigators never established exactly where Cindy was held during the 19 days she was missing, only that her condition pointed away from where she was ultimately found. And whether Lawhead targeted her specifically or crossed paths with her by chance that afternoon in Granite Bay was never officially confirmed. Neither detail will likely surface now. What this case shows isn't one dramatic turning point. It's evidence collected in 1991, technology that didn't yet exist, and a database never built to solve a murder, arriving, finally, at the same answer.